Let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Stefaan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab, and I'm delighted to chair today's third annual State of Open Data Policy Summit, which hopes to bring the open data community together to focus and reflect on what's the current state of open data, and also what's the current state of open data policy that seeks to accelerate access to data for reuse in the public sector. In today's session, we will focus on the pertinent question on whether we are entering a data winter, or the opposite question, whether actually we are witnessing a revival and a possible new phase or a new wave, as we might call it, of open data. And that's basically the question that will guide many of the panels today. But also, of course, we will hope to reflect on generic developments that we need to take into account as we are moving forward in accelerating access to data for positive reuse at a time, of course, of artificial intelligence as well. And let me set the stage on why we decided to focus on this question, because if one may reflect on what is the current state of open data and access to data for reuse, one may want to go to Charles Dickens, and especially his Tale of Two Cities, where the introduction basically stated that it was the best of times and possibly the worst of times. And one may also reflect, is that actually a statement that also can be applied to open data? And what I hope to explain in the next 5 minutes is that reflecting on open data and the current state of open data, we may indeed be in actually the best of times, but potentially also the worst of times. And let me explain what we mean by that, and start with the worst of times, because what Charles Dickens was also referring in his first paragraph is that it might have been the spring of hope, but it was also the winter of despair. And the question that I have posed in a recent blog was whether we are actually entering a data winter at a time when AI is actually experiencing a summer. And let me briefly explain by positioning a few exhibits. The first exhibit is that we actually have seen a decline in access to platform data. Many social media platforms have closed their API, and some might even have said that we are entering a post-API environment where private sector data that typically was easily available for researchers, but also for other purposes in order to understand trends in society, has become harder to obtain. Second exhibit that led me to reflect on whether we're actually entering a data winter is where we also see, for instance, that climate data, which typically was open science data, has also become more and more proprietary closed, and as a result has become an issue that makes it harder for scientists, but also for policymakers to have access to in order to inform their decisions as well, at a time when we actually need access to climate data in order to mitigate and prevent further climate decline. The other exhibit that I want to present here is that we also, at a time of generative AI, and we will discuss that probably throughout today's summit as well, we have seen that we also are entering what some might have called a generative AI anxiety. By which we mean is that many data holders have become anxious about providing access to their data out of fear that their data might get extracted for training or fine-tuning purposes without a return on actually investment, or without a benefit to the communities that might have developed the data set in the first place. And we see this playing out within the context, for instance, of peer-to-peer knowledge commons, where some of the communities have really started raising concerns about making their data freely open in order to prevent this kind of potentially extractive behavior. But we also have seen that others like Tumblr and WordPress are starting to monetize some of the data that has been used and provided by the users of those platforms. And so there's a big kind of discussion and a big concern at the moment in those communities, whether this is the appropriate way to provide access to data, or whether we should come up with different models, such as, for instance, a redefined data commons kind of environment as well. Now, what we will share today as well is we also not only looked at some of the signals that we see in the broader society, but we also went back to our data stewards community. I mean, for some of you might know that for the last few years, the GovLab has been training data stewards and have been providing boot camps and dedicated courses in order to create this kind of new profession, which we call a reimagined data steward, in order to accelerate access to data in a more systematic, sustainable, and responsible way. Now, the result is that we now have a critical alumni of data stewards. And so we reached out to our alumni in order to understand what they feel the trends are. And this is what we're going to release today, the kind of reflections. And basically, the reflection is that many are feeling that we are in a stagnating environment where open data is anyway still more prevalent than it was before, but that it is actually at a certain kind of plateau, and that we don't see a rapid increase in actually making more data available. And others also said, yes, there's more open data, but what we really need is quality data. And then the last exhibit that I will present here in order to document the winter of open data is kind of our repository of open data policies, which is a repository where we collect what is happening in the open data policy environment. And what we have seen is also kind of a decline of activity, or much of the activity is actually trying to make data open at the margins, as opposed to having more of a radical and more comprehensive kind of approach to open data as well. Now, that's the bad news. And that's why I started reflecting on, are we actually in the worst times of open data? And of course, that needs to be taken with anyway the necessary kind of metaphoric perspective. But the question might also be, generative AI might actually also provide for a new wave. And is this actually entering the kind of best, the spring of hope, as Charles Dickens would say? And this is based upon a report that we recently published, which was trying to reflect on whether we are entering the fourth wave of open data as a result of generative AI, where we identify a whole range of scenarios where open data and generative AI come together. And of course, one of the most exciting scenarios is where actually generative AI can be used to provide a more conversational interface with open data, which might democratize data more than ever before as well. And so one of the questions that we will try to understand today as well, what are those kinds of components of a possible fourth wave of open data? And is open data even ready to leverage some of the generative AI tools that might provide a new wave of open data as well? And so that's kind of my introduction, why we decided this year in our third annual State of Open Data to really reflect on this kind of environment that we are in, where on the one hand, it might be the worst time, where we see a decline of backsliding, but on the other hand, we also might see signs of hope, where actually new technologies might provide a new wave of democratizing data as well. But that's from my point of view, and that's why we also try to provide another voice, which is, of course, Silvana Fumega, who is the director of the Global Data Barometer, which is kind of the main instrument to really, from an evidence perspective, understand, do we actually see an increase in data, or do we see kind of a backsliding, or do we see, to a large extent, something that might be the spring, an indication of a new spring that might emerge as well.